Hey guys, today it's all about the Dodge Viper. This is the car that Mopar lovers dreamed about as a kid, the flagship performance car for Dodge, long before the days of the Hellcats and Demons. I'll admit I haven't done too much Viper content yet on the channel. With 5 different generations and tons of various models, changes and cancellations from 1992 to 2017, it can get overwhelming with information. But I want to change that going forward, and what better way to start by looking at the origins of this snake and why it came about. How does a company just suddenly decide to produce a massively powerful coupe with a V10? So I thought it'd be interesting to take a deeper look into how the Dodge Viper was born. You can find the video outline on screen now. Lots of this information comes from Motor Trend, as well as from former Chrysler president Bob Lutz's own recollection from his book called Guts, The 7 Laws of Business That Made Chrysler the World's Hottest Car Company. So we can go back to around 1988 to begin this story. The very first thought of any type of vehicle like a Viper came from Chrysler president at the time, Bob Lutz. He had previously been the executive vice president at Ford Motor Company and drove a 1985 Autocraft Mark IV Cobra that he had from his time with Ford. It was claimed that he came into work after a weekend of spirited driving in Michigan and asked his colleagues, quote, "Wouldn't it be kind of cool if we had our own Cobra?" End quote. Of course, around this time in 1988, Chrysler was relying on the outdated K-body vehicles, a platform that had been introduced in 1981, used on many vehicles like the Chrysler LeBaron and Dodge Aries. 4 cylinders were commonly used, with a few V6s for these types of vehicles. So at first glance, something like the Viper seemed inconceivable. However, this was a time where Chrysler was transitioning as a company, killing off the K platform in 1989, and previewing their 1993 release of the LH platform of vehicles, famous for the cab-forward design, with the Chrysler Portofino sedan concept. Chrysler was also making big moves, purchasing American Motors Corporation or AMC on March 9, 1987, and thus acquiring Jeep, and also acquiring Lamborghini that same year. So now we're still in 1988, and Lutz goes into the design chief Tom Gale's office to discuss something. He wanted an affordable everyday substitute to a Ferrari and had aims of 400 horsepower, again inspired by his Cobra. Obviously, Lutz was the president of the company and he had quite a bit of power, so Gale would start working on sketches and clay designs, and then, quote, Bob was kind of blown away, end quote. So what you see on screen now for the next while would be the 1989 Viper concept car. The next step past this artwork was creating a full-size concept vehicle. Metal Crafters in California was outsourced to build a machine based on Gale's design, and they built Chrysler's concept cars for the next 20 years or so after that. As for the powertrain, a V10 was desired, so they ended up using 2 fuel-injected 360 cubic inch versions of the older 318 engines, welding them together, and having Roush Engineering graphed 2 cylinders, increasing the 360 to a 450 cubic inch V10 for the concept. Now we will move to January 1989, where the concept was unveiled at the 1989 North American International Auto Show in Detroit. It was about as bare bones as you could get in terms of options. It had a simple radio, no side windows, door handles, air conditioning, inboard brakes off of the rear differential, and an insufficient cooling system for the V10. In fact, the car could only be driven for a few minutes to move inside the building, or it would overheat, and it never even exceeded 5 miles per hour. But that didn't really matter for this concept, as it had jaw-dropping looks, wide 17-inch wheels, smoked headlights, a low sleek body, and even a side exhaust. As for the name, that was pretty simple. Chrysler decided to go with the Viper, the snake next in line to the Cobra, where this whole thing kind of started. Lutz wrote in his book about how the concept, quote, blew the roof off, as nothing remotely like it had ever been displayed by an American or foreign volume producer, end quote. The Viper had intense and immediate popularity, with tons of media coverage on TV, finding it on the cover of all the magazines, and sending people into a Viper frenzy. So now the show was in January 1989, and we're going to move along to April, where a Viper development team began to assemble. And overall, the Viper development team would have 85 people down the road, but obviously this is just the beginning. So Lutz had 3 rules for new projects. 1, a $50 million budget. 2, 36 months or 3 years to get it to production in time for the next 1992 Detroit show. And 3, be ethical, moral, and don't get Lutz in trouble. So the Motor Trend article talks a lot about engineer Herb Helbig, who was one of the first to join the Viper team. There was a secret invite-only meeting held to discuss the project internally, but somehow 300 people showed up anyways. One key figure in all of this is Roy Schoberg, who would be named the Viper chief engineer, so quite a bit of power for the project. He interviewed Helbig, and after losing track and talking for 3 hours, he was welcomed to the team. I was surprised to find out that this was risky business, and to join the Viper team you had to give up your day job, and should the Viper project fail, you would need to reapply for another position within Chrysler or find another employer. So there's a lot of good and bad with the engineers that decided to jump on board with the project. Schoberg decided to build 2 versions in the early stages, with one being a test mule car so he could better convince management to give them more green lights during development, since they could actually drive this one. So one tester was called VM01, which you can see on screen in white, and the second was VM02, on screen in red. They looked pretty similar to the concept brought to the auto show. They had a fiberglass body, the chassis and suspension were intended for production, but there was hesitation about the engine. An iron block V8 and a 5-speed manual transmission were originally used, and there were some rumors saying this was done to please Carroll Shelby, who preferred 8-cylinder engines, even though he wouldn't end up with a huge role in the Viper. A Keith Black 426 Hemi V8 was also considered, but that engine was too wide to fit into the narrow body. Even though the V8 engine would have been an easier choice, the team decided they needed to use something really unique, and that ended up being a V10 engine. So now this is where Lamborghini enters into the equation. To summarize, Chrysler had wanted to get more involved with Lamborghini and gain experience from them, so they would send out their engineers for 6 to 12 month assignments to work on various things with them in Italy. A man by the name of Dick Winkles was the first, working on Lamborghini V10s in Modena. Winkles got back to Chrysler in April of 1989, and he was immediately assigned to the Viper team, as he claims he was, quote, probably member 9 or 10 of the original Viper team under Roy Schoberg, end quote. So obviously it looks like Chrysler wanted to use his expertise with V10 engines. So going back to the 2 test mules, the VM01 was built with a 5.9 liter V8 with 300 horsepower, that's the white one, and the VM02, the red one, had an iron V10 with 360 horsepower. Lamborghini was asked to supply prototype parts and improve the design for manufacturing and performance, and Winkles claims that their input still influenced the modern Viper engines. The first 3 V10 long block assemblies were cast, machined, and assembled at Lamborghini Modena in Italy, and then the complete engines were shipped back to Chrysler. So those would be the only 3 Viper engines ever to be built in Italy. Now we can move forward to October of 1990, where uncertainty had been mounting over whether the Viper would really get to production. Schoberg took Chrysler chairman Lee Iacocca for a ride in the VM02 tester with the V10, and Iacocca also drove it around that morning in Highland Park in Michigan. After the ride, Iacocca told Bob Lutz, quote, "What are you waiting for?" end quote. And the Viper officially had the green light for production after he saw what an amazing machine it was. It's also worth noting that Dodge built a 1991 Viper RT10 prototype. Supposedly they say 30 were built for testing, and also one pre-production model in 1992, which both of those you can find on screen going forward. Anyways, despite all the excitement, there were a few major obstacles. First of all, with dealing with Getrag, a German transmission manufacturer. They were unwilling to cooperate to fix a significant flaw in the tail housing, proclaiming that it wouldn't be a problem, with Chrysler claiming it would be due to reckless American drivers and their often very harsh shifting. So Getrag wanted twice the price and a few $1,000,000 up front to fix the problem, but Chrysler didn't want to move past their $50 million budget. So Borg Warner was called instead, and they supplied a Viper-specific housing around a 6-speed manual transmission, finishing that in 1991. With the engine and transmission all figured out, the final obstacle were the tires. The 2 test Vipers used Goodyear Eagle GTs because Chrysler had a good working relationship with them. The production Viper was set to get 2 75-35s in the front and 3 35-35s in the rear, so Goodyear and Michelin were put to the task at what was known as the Halloween Shootout. So both tire companies showed up at a track with all of their tire models, and every Chrysler driver tested each one out one by one. They heavily favored the Michelins, but Chrysler still wanted to use the Goodyear. After Lutz drove the VM01 with both Michelins and Goodyears and didn't know which was which, the Michelins became the obvious choice and he agreed to go ahead with those. Now, by May of 1991, the Viper was chosen as the pace vehicle for the Indianapolis 500 race, after the previous choice, the Dodge Stealth, was not deemed to be American enough, and Carroll Shelby drove the pre-production car there. As you remember, we briefly talked about that. They made one of those, in red. In November 1991, the Viper was then released to reviewers, and by January of 1992, the 1992 Dodge Viper RT10 was shipping to customers. The project had been completed in just 33 months, using the budgeted $50 million for parts, and adding another $35 million in engineering, research, and development. So that's kind of the story of the birth of the Dodge Viper. And before we end off the video, we will talk a bit about the first gen, with model years from 1992 to 1995. The Viper sold for around $60,000 to start, and it was actually pretty similar to the concept in terms of the looks and the lack of features. It sold 122 in the first year, and then in the thousands after that. It was a beautiful ride, with the Dodge Crosshair grille prominent in the center, large side scoops where the doors meet the fenders, and a roof canvas. The Viper was still pretty bare bones in production form, coming without traction control, anti-lock brakes, exterior door handles, key locks, or air conditioning. Just to get in, you had to unzip a vinyl window to reach the interior door release. And yes, the side windows weren't even glass, and they had to be zipped to open up. The Viper still had very basic features like manually adjusted seats, a radio, a clock, carpets, and an option for a light fiberglass roof instead of the canvas. Of course, none of that really mattered because of the performance. The co-developed Chrysler and Lamborghini 8-liter V10 ended up making 400 horsepower and 465 pound-feet of torque, while paired with the Borg-Warner 6-speed manual transmission. With a curb weight of 3,534 pounds, the Viper was good for 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds, quarter mile in 12.8 seconds, and had a top speed of 168 miles per hour. So those numbers made it faster than a new Chevy Corvette or Porsche 911 Carrera 2 at the time. 1993 would see the Viper GTS concept, and that would end up debuting in 1996 as part of the second generation. And 5 generations, and 25 years later, in 2017 the Viper was finally cancelled. Chrysler's purchase of Lamborghini ended up not being a very good investment, but as Lutz said, at least there was one positive. Quote, "The V10 engine designs were all the concrete value we got out of the financially disastrous Lambo investment." End quote. So that's the end of this video, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed looking at the birth of the Dodge Viper and how it came to life. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for all your Mopar videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.